Wonderful to be here with all of you in this space. And I did buy more beads this week, so that collection just grew even bigger. Now, just be patient with me for a second because I'm going to share my screen, mostly for me, because looking at me while talking is very strange. All right. So again, thank you all of you for being part of this conversation today, for being part of this dialogue, for volunteering your feedback. It was wonderful to see what you were interested in, and I did my best to be as inclusive of all of the feedback that was received. And Angela introduced me well, but I'll also just mention that I am a learner in this space too, and this path of reconciliation that we are on is something that we're all navigating together. And working together to create new pathways of belonging, new building, new pathways of healing, and everything in between. And so I just appreciate the space that we have today. And I do want to just start off with an acknowledgement of where I am joining from today. I am joining from the traditional territories of the Katzie and Kwantlen First Nations, and I offer this acknowledgement with appreciation and gratitude, not just for the way the nations have stewarded this territory since time immemorial and will continue to do so for future generations, but also for the commitment these territories have offered to reconciliation and sharing teachings and sharing knowledge and being part of the community and inviting into the community. And in acknowledging the peoples of this territory, I also want to offer my commitment, that my commitment to honoring reconciliation as a guest on this territory is to do my best to move forward the pathways of healing and to hold spaces of conversation and dialogue so that we can grow and move forward in a good way together. And with that, I do want to invite a moment of silence to reflect on the territory that you are joining from. Take a moment, think about your relationship to peoples, to land, to our non-human relatives, and all of the things that come up in between. So I'll just give you a moment to reflect on your relationship to territory. Those pauses are never long enough, and I always want to give it more space and invite more space, especially for us to share with each other. And I saw a couple of you have shared in the chat. And I just want to invite you to carry this acknowledgement with you throughout our work today, and also think about the commitment that is being made when we offer this territory acknowledgement on committing to reconciliation, to committing to finding new pathways and holding ourselves accountable to those commitments. I also want to embody the slowness that we're going to move in. And we're going to move intentionally with slowness today and really root ourselves in slowing down, being intentional with the words that we say, the teachings that we share, and how we build the pathway of reconciliation outwards through Indigenous values and worldviews. And so today, our intentions are going to be rooting ourselves in those values first by spending some time engaging with them, spending some time learning what they are from my perspective, and then how we can root the pathways ahead in healing through those relational values in a culturally
Have
humble and
a
safe way.
great day. I'm in the car on the way to work listening to.
Okay, there we go. All right. And so here we are. We're going to be creating space to focus in on Indigenous ways of being. One of the things that is not going to be highlighted in our conversation, but is very important, is the truth piece. It will come up, especially when we're talking about cultural humility, but it's important to me that I very clearly define when we're working on truth and when we're working with Indigenous peoples' values, worldviews, and experiences, because very often these views are treated interchangeably. And we are not our experiences. We are our traditions, our values, our culture, our regalia, our languages, and everything in between. And so truth will come up in this conversation today, and it is necessary that we go and continue our learning for truth. But we acknowledge that we don't have the space today for that. That is not the intention of the space. But as we talk about truth and reconciliation, they are woven together, and truth must always be part of the reconciliation process. So, what is the plan for our hour and a half-ish together? Well, I want to say we have a guide to the day. I have the screen open, I have the chat box open. If we go in a different direction because of questions and reflections, that's perfectly fine with me. I think my talking style is what I call going rogue, which means talking from the heart. Sometimes a story or teaching will pop up, which will take priority over what the plan was. And that also works in the framework of our discussion. If there's a question that pops up, if there's a reflection that would be really helpful from that conversation, I'm happy to pause and go in that direction, and the river will go where it wants to go. Adding to that, I also have space hopefully planned at the end for us to have an open dialogue for questions that are related to today, or what I call the 2 a.m. shower thoughts that haven't had space to be reflected or talked about. And so I really want us to have a question space for us to really just sit in dialogue and process the work together. And I'm going to focus on two parts based on the feedback that all of you provided, which are worldviews, and then how do we move in a value-rooted way to support cultural humility. Finally, I'm not caffeinated. I'm drinking tea today, so I shouldn't talk too fast, but I know I do. So feel invited to tell me to slow down, to repeat that, or anything in between, because I know that I get excited, and the more excited I get, the faster I talk. So feel welcome to ask me to slow down. You can even flag and say the caffeine is kicking in. Whatever it is that works for you, I'm open and welcome to that feedback. All right, I sped through the introductions-ish. And every time I open up a space, I like to start off by reintroducing Indigenous peoples and reintroducing the terminology that I use when talking, because they have different definitions for different people. When we talk about things like decolonization and indigenization, they mean different things. And so I'll start off with just acknowledging that Indigenous peoples is a term that I use a lot, and it is an umbrella term for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. But we cannot just stop dividing that umbrella terminology there. We also need to address that when we say Indigenous peoples, there are 1.8 million different ways to be Indigenous. There's going to be multiple cultures within that First Nations category. There are over 630 nations in this nation. And so with that, there's going to be different languages, different stories, different teachings, different cultures. And the biggest thing about Indigenous diversity is one, we are rooted in our lands. If we were to translate the meaning of a lot of nations, their names would translate to people of the land, people of the moss, people of the mountains, people of the territory. And so when we think about First Nations communities specifically, the peoples are going to be rooted in that territory. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Adding to this, when we think about Inuit communities, we're talking about 4 different regions of Inuit Nunangat. Métis communities have settlements across Turtle Island outside of those legally recognized in Alberta. And then also we have the impacts of colonization on whether Indigenous communities are urbanized, on reserve, off reserve, multiracial like myself, reconnecting, reclaiming, all of the different identities and relationships that people have with their First Nation ancestry, their Inuit ancestry, their Métis ancestry, or being a mix of those 3 ancestries are going to have a different relationship. Why am I focusing so hard on this? Well, when we think about reconciliation, we cannot think about reconciliation as repairing a relationship between Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples. Instead, it is reconciliation with the 1.8 million Indigenous peoples and the 1.8 million different relationships. To put this into an example, let's talk about nations. If we think about nations that are in urban centers, such as Musqueam Nation, there is an interest in reconciliation through economic development. If we think about nations up north, there is reconciliation through accessing drinking water and having access to water. And so each nation has a diverse need in the reconciliation process. And so when we're talking about Indigenous peoples, we have to be very specific about who and where we are reconciling and be very relational in it, deeply listening to those that we are in relationship with and responding with reconciliation pathways that honor the needs that they are sharing. And we'll talk more about that, and that'll be a general theme as we talk about ways that we move through reconciliation today. One of the terms that come out with acknowledging this diversity is the struggle of pan-indigenization, which is a term for treating all Indigenous peoples the same. And that is something that we can avoid and start off our cultural safety and humility journey with, which is how do we treat all Indigenous peoples as unique and diverse with their relationship to their Indigenous ancestry, whether it be because they come from the three different groups, because they're community rooted, because they have different connections with their home territory. One other thing I'll quickly mention, it is not a framework of today, but I will mention that my definitions of reconciliation, decolonization, and indigenization are very specific. When I talk about truth and reconciliation cannot be separated. Truth meaning acknowledging colonial histories and ongoing colonization. Reconciliation is an act of reparations, of repairing a relationship and restoring harms and undoing harms. Decolonization for me is creating space for Indigenous people to re-exist in their full authenticity, which means creating space so that we can be our authentic selves and accepted for it. And then indigenization is in partnership, where we have the space to come in as who we are and reestablish our traditions, our ways of being, our practices, our laws, and everything that makes us who we are on a fundamental level. The final thing I'll mention, just from a terminology perspective, is colonial versus Western practices. I am very careful when I use the word colonial and when I use the word Western. Colonial for me is systemic oppression. It is the act of conquering peoples. And that is the problematic piece in reconciliation work, is that we're still under systemic barriers, systemic oppression. And Western is a culture that came from Europe. And so Western cultures are not the problem that we're addressing. We are addressing the systemic oppression that removes Indigenous ones. And so often when we say things like decolonize, we are saying removing the conquering of peoples. We are not saying removing Western practice. And those are two very separate things for me. And I think as we do the heavy work of talking about decolonizing, that distinction helps us navigate it in a much safer way. Okay, the intros are done. And I want to start by embodying the principles and worldviews that have been taught to me. So one of the most important ways that I acknowledge our worldviews is through story work. And I'm going to start off our space by sharing a story and then unpacking why that story embodies who we are as peoples. I also want to just remind everyone that I am an urban multiracial member of the Adjo First Nation, which means I have a very unique lens. And so the teachings I share are from my lens. You may hear different stories, different interpretations, different understandings of worldviews. And I really hope that you hear different perspectives because that means you're experiencing our full diversity. And so I want to share a story that I heard a lot growing up from my grandmother. And I used to beg her for this story, but there were rules. Number one, the rule was that I could not hear the story unless we were picking blackberries, which meant I had to wait all the way till August to get this story. And two, I had to put on my jeans and get out in the thorn bushes. And then for me to get this story, I had to be very quiet and patient. And she would wait until I'd been quiet for at least 15 minutes for me to be able to actually sit and listen. Eventually, my little 6-year-old self would finally settle down and be quiet enough to hear. It's a long story, so I'll give you the abbreviated version. She would tell me the story of a family of bears. And once upon a time, this family of bears had a little bear. And Little Bear finally learned how to walk. And when Little Bear learned how to walk, the parents decided, oh, it's time. Little Bear can come to the blackberries with us. And so Little Bear ran out into the blackberry fields and got so excited and tried his first ever blackberry. Oh my goodness, that was the best thing that Baby Bear had ever eaten ever. So for the next hour, Baby Bear just kept eating and eating and eating. Okay. Well, the parents finished picking and said, okay, Baby Bear, it's time to go. We're going to go to bed. Baby Bear pouted and followed the parents home, but was in bed and couldn't stop thinking about those berries. Oh, they were so sweet. So Baby Bear snuck out of the den and wandered over to the blackberry patch. Baby Bear's little, very tiny. And so Baby Bear was eating and eating and eating, but because his little paws couldn't reach the top, he had to keep going deeper and deeper into the bushes. Uh-oh. Baby Bear looked around and realized it was dark and he couldn't see the way out, and there weren't a lot of berries left. Over the next couple of days, the parents were looking for Baby Bear, but they couldn't hear his little voice far, far into the patch. Now, okay, Baby Bear is just kind of running out of food and getting skinnier and skinnier because the berries that he can reach are dwindling. Over the next month, he gets smaller and smaller, and the leaves start to fall off of those blackberry bushes, revealing just sticks and thorns. When Baby Bear can finally see the direction home, he starts crawling out and sees his parents in the field, and he goes, "Hey, I see you, I'm here." He crawls out, but the thorns are sticking to his fur, and when he comes out to his parents, he looks thorny and skinnier than ever before. His parents don't recognize his little voice, and there came to be the first porcupine. And so this story that my grandmother used to tell me has so much in it, and it reminds us of so many different things. And it's a really great introduction to our worldviews for multiple reasons, and I'll kind of map out what that looks like. Firstly, it embodied the teachings that our generations, the younger generations, are responsible from learning from their elders. And so we must be patiently listening and quiet and ready to receive what they are willing to offer. We also have to make sure that our minds and bodies are connected. And so I would only receive these teachings when I was sitting still and when I was out quieting my mind, but also moving my hands. So it's an embodied practice. It also reminded us that the rules and protocols that we have are not punishments. Protocols are not about having consequences. They're about recognizing that these guidelines are created for our safety. The parents didn't tell Baby Bear not to eat anymore because they were punishing Baby Bear. They were saying, "We're protecting you. You shouldn't be out there alone." They were also introducing the worldview of relationality and reminding us that you only take what you need. I remember those blackberries. I would get so excited when the blackberries showed up on those bushes because I would say, "Story time." And my grandmother would look at me and she would say, 1 week. 1 week because the birds need to eat first. You have food in the fridge. They haven't eaten all season. And so we would wait. And that reminds us about our responsibility to Mother Nature and all of nature around us, which is we need to leave some for others. And Baby Bear was only supposed to pick what filled his stomach and then go home. And there was consequences to being greedy and not making sure that the world around you is in balance. And so when we think about story work, stories are often how we share multiple things about who we are. Stories tell us where we come from, each nation having their own origin story saying how they came to be in this land. The origin stories have multiple layers and purposes to them. I'm thinking about two in mind particularly. And they tell us, one, where we came from is from the land. Remember that we are people of the. If we are people of the mountains, that origin story will tell us how we came to be from the mountains. And that story is to remind us that we came from nature and must respect it and be in harmony with it. It is also to remind us of how to live in good relationship with the land. These stories that we hear from our very young age are to tell us, how do we live in good relation? How do we move gently on this land? Sometimes when I talk about Indigenous protocols and how they are part of being welcomed into a territory, protocols are a gift. They are instructions from generations on how do we live well in the territory that we are in. They are not rules. They are supportive guidelines of achieving the purpose of life. And the purpose of life, the way I've been taught, is balance. How do we live in balance with everything around us? And stories teach us. Stories tell us how to live in balance. And often those stories are going to be about animals, whether it's Trickster Coyote and Raven, whether it's Baby Bear, or whether it is going to be a story of the whales in the ocean. Animals are used to show us how to live in good relation, and their trickster stories tell us what happens when we don't live in balance, when we don't respect Mother Nature. And we're told that in the form of animals to not single someone out. Instead, once again, we're being guided in a good direction. So when I think about the power of stories, stories are our worldviews, and they're going to be unique nation to nation. They're going to be unique family to family sometimes. And so if we want to know who Indigenous peoples are, if we want to know who a community is, spend time listening to their stories. It will tell you who they are, how they live with the land, and what values are central to their way of being. That porcupine story is my favorite for completely unrelated reasons. It's the only story my grandmother would tell me with voices. It's the only time she'd pretend to have claws or she would growl at me. All the other ones she told super seriously, but not that one. Definitely a 6-year-old reason to like it. And so this leads us to, what do these worldviews have in common? As I mentioned, there are 1.8 million different ways to be Indigenous. And so it's hard for me to share with you Indigenous worldviews because there isn't one. There are 1.8 million. But they do often, if not always, have a shared value system. And the value system is something that I can share because it is a heartbeat that is going to run through so many Indigenous communities. And sometimes in research, these are called the 4 Rs. I don't like that. Instead, I call relationality the heart value. And relationality is part of what leads our communities and our ways of being and our value systems. Part of being in good relationship is being respectful, being responsible, and being reciprocal. And so if we are relational, all of the other values will fall into place. Now, when we think about these values, we need to think about them from an Indigenous perspective. And I'll start off with talking about relationality and reciprocity from an example standpoint, and then we can unpack them in a way that feels good to us, I hope. And so when I think about relationality, I'm talking about how we are interconnected with the entire world around us. How everything that has a spirit has connections to us. Now, when we hear the word spirit, we sometimes give it religious tendencies, but that's not the intention here. The belief is that Creator put a little bit of energy into everything created. Anything natural has energy and spirit inside of it. Everything was made intentionally with a purpose. And so our role, if we're going to focus on balance, is to balance these energies. Anything natural needs to be in balance. That means the rocks, the sky, the ground, the trees, the water, the people, the squirrels, the ants, the raccoons, everything we need to be in good relationship with. And I like to think of relationality in terms of a spider web. If we were to take a few minutes and map out all of the things that we are in relation to on a map, and sometimes I do this activity, but we won't today, we would map out ourselves at the center, and I can include it later if you like. And we would say, okay, what are all the things I'm related to? And we think about just the natural resources we use that morning, whether it be water, whether it be food, and realize that everything is inherently valuable. Now, if we were to look at a spider web with everything on it, people, animals, nature, water, that's a big spider web. And everything touches and is connected somewhere. If you look at a spider web and you're out in nature and you touch it, it doesn't matter where you touch the spider web. If something gets disturbed, the whole web will fall in onto itself. You can touch the top, the bottom, the side, it doesn't matter where. Something caused imbalance, something caused harm, and the whole thing crumbled in. And so we have a responsibility to all relations on that web to ensure that they are in balance. Because if one part of that web suffers, the whole web will, because we are interconnected. The other part of that is that we have a responsibility to everything on that web to be in balance, which is that reciprocity piece. So when we think about reciprocity, I want us to move into a different definition. Sometimes when we think about reciprocity, it can come off transactional. So I'll give you an example. If you've ever had a friend come over and bring you a gift, and you panic, that's not reciprocity. I know you want to give something back, but wanting to give something back is transactional. You want to complete the exchange. It's a one-to-one belief, or you'll be like, oh, I'll get them a gift next time. If you buy someone a birthday present because they bought you a birthday present, again, not reciprocity. It's a transaction. Reciprocity in a greater Indigenous lens would recognize that we are in relationship with a big web, and it's giving what you can and only taking what you need. And knowing that when you give what you can, it'll circle its way through the web. And at some point, this year, next year, 20 years from now, when you need something, that web will give it back to you. It's looking at how good cycles through all of the relations, and good will come back to you when you need it most. And so you might never give gifts, but you're the friend that someone can call and need that hasn't talked to you in 3 years. That's reciprocity because you're in relationship and you're willing to give what you can when you can. And so when I think about this value system, relationality is recognizing that we are all interconnected, human and non-human. And I do invite you after today to sit and spend some time mapping out all of the ways that you are interconnected to the world around you. Everyone on this meeting is interconnected. We're all interconnected to water if we've had water in the last 24 hours, which I hope we have. And so if we've had those connections, that means we're all in relationship. And then that last value that we haven't acknowledged yet is respect. And when I mentioned that Creator put energy into every natural being, whether they are human, non-human, rock, tree, water, we must respect that they are inherently valuable, that they were created with purpose. Everything was created intentionally, and we must respect the value of everything, not putting ourselves above or below. If we were to imagine that spider web, one common theme is that a spider web always has a hole in the center because nothing is central to everything else. We are all equal and offer value into the space. That also works with people. Everyone has something to offer in a space. And if we were to think about traditional views of community or why sometimes in Indigenous spaces we sit in circle, it's exactly for that reason. Because everyone needs to be present and be there to contribute their gift. And so the final teaching I'll share from my grandmother before we have some space is the teaching of the special gift. And my grandmother used to say, oh, you're great, you. And I never knew what that meant. She would just be like, great, you. And sometimes I would be like, what does that even mean? It wasn't until I got older and I got the full story behind it that I realized that she was telling me that you are great no matter what. You were born great. And it's not you're born great in a Western sense. It is you are born inherently valuable to your community. And she said that every single person has something to offer and a special skill that makes them necessary to our relational ecosystem. And so some of us are naturally great at talking. I love to talk. Some of us are naturally good at building things. Some of us are naturally wonderful at painting or problem solving, fixing cars, whatever it is. All of us have a natural talent that can be brought into our community circle. And the goal is to nurture that talent in you. Find the thing that you are good at and learn it well. And if everyone in our community focused on that special gift that they had, and we're giving what we can, which is our gift, and only taking what we need, we will have everything together and that circle will be complete. And so when we think about reconciliation and as we move towards that cultural humility space and how do we create new pathways, how do we heal, how do we make steps forward, that is going to be the guiding principle, which is what is our special gift? What is that thing that you offer the world and how can we support using it for the betterment of healing and moving towards change? You might have a special gift at chatting people up and saying, let's have this conversation. You might be great at holding space and being a really good deep listener. You might be a great problem solver who can hear the feedback and say, okay, this is the problem. Here's some ideas to fix it. And finding those special talents within you will be how we create that pathway. And that is why often, especially in these spaces, and we'll talk about this too, there's no map. There's no list of things to do because it's going to be very relational if we're walking in relational worldviews. It's relationship to self. What do I have to offer? What are my skills? And what are the spaces that I enter? And it's relational to those you are working with. Who are the indigenous peoples that I'm working with? Who are the ones being impacted by this? Who are the host nations? How are they being impacted by this? And it's a really relational and reflective process that doesn't have one pathway. And so I'll sum up the worldviews in a simpler way, and then I'll give you some time to reflect and engage together. And so when we think about these worldviews, I really want us to just center relationality. Center that we are humans first before everything else, and that we need to put relationships as a priority in everything that we do, human and non-human relationships. Whenever we are thinking about our relationship to water and we see ourselves connected to it, as soon as we see that connection on our web, we have an obligation to respect the role water plays in our way of being. We have a responsibility to be reciprocal and balance those relationships. And so we must honor everything that we are in relationship with before everything else. That means time might move slower. That means we might have to build in more space to have those connections. But that is going to be the priority in moving in a value-rooted way through reconciliation, is how can we be relational and honor all of the relationships that we are in? And that is where we're going to root ourselves for the cultural humility piece as we move ahead. So with that, I want to give you a little bit of time to debrief. I will ask Angela to put you in groups of 3 to 4-ish. I don't know what the numbers are, so you know best. And I have some possible reflection questions, but what I really would encourage you to do is go rogue. And by grow rogue, I mean spend some time digesting, reflecting, talking about how these worldviews sit for you. Come up with any questions that you may have that I can answer before we move ahead to ensure that there's enough space for them, and anything that comes up in between. Feel free I can pop these into the chat if you like while you're in breakout rooms if you'd like them. You can also screenshot the screen if you like, but just spend some time digesting and then we'll come back together. And I'll give you about 5 to 7 minutes-ish. I'll hopefully be able to give you a warning before that happens.
Okay, the breakout rooms are open. Hopefully you can see them.
And then we can pause the recording.
Recording.
I don't know if that was me or you. All right, so I hope you had a quick chat. I know it's not long enough. I really wish we had time for 30-minute dialogues as groups and teams, but I hope it gave you a little bit of a chance to reflect and share together, and that it's an invitation to reach out to your group again after this conversation and spend more time debriefing and connecting and being relational, which is what you're going to hear me say for the next 45 minutes. Be relational. And I joke about it, but I'm very serious about it at the same time. And so with that, before we move into the cultural safety and rooting cultural safety in Indigenous value systems, specifically relationality, I just want to hold space. Are there any questions or things that came up during your chat that you would like to put into the space before we move forward? I see a hand. Yes, please.
Hi, thanks, Jalissa. So we had two main points that came up in the breakout room. One is if you have grown up in a colonial setting yourself, and now you are here in Canada, then your worldviews are certainly shaped by your upbringing. So knowingly or unknowingly, your worldviews are formed by the influences that have shaped you. So there's a certain amount of sensitivity that you carry within yourself when you're looking at indigenous peoples and the topics that are being discussed in this country around indigenous groups. That's one point that came up, and then the other one was how often do we, when we have to introduce ourselves, we kind of say our names and this is my role and this is the organization I work with. And if we were not to say those things and just basically be human uh, at the core, then there's a certain beauty in recognizing that aspect of us. So I really loved the conversation we had in the breakout. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that. You're making me think about how I very often emphasize relationality as that people first principle. Like we put the person before everything. And usually that seems like it takes a lot of space and we get a little anxious about it because we have things that we're trying to do. But relationality actually long term makes things quicker. And one, I would say the people first matters. Like the amount of times that I am in an hour meeting and we spend 35 minutes catching up because we've built in time to authentically connect with that person, the work actually gets faster because now I'm in a safe position to be like, that's not a good fit for me, or like, you do that, I do this. And you're in this like relational space where you can navigate some things that might be kind of harder to do if you're being overly polite, right? Like, this is my role, this is your role. How do you want to approach this? And then you're in that polite navigation space versus we're both people, we've both connected, we know each other a little bit better. How do we move from here? And so that people first has a lot of connection place. And I love that idea of introducing yourself without saying what you do and starting to introduce, like, I'm from this territory, or I love to bead, I love to cook, I love to race cars, whatever it is. And really just sharing our authentic selves in a space. And I think that's part of the decolonial work. And one of the second things that I was thinking about is how we're all influenced by the way that we are in the spaces that we are raised in. And when I think about these indigenous worldviews, these are things that we're bringing back into re-existence. These are things that we're trying to rebuild. And all peoples on Turtle Island, whether you are indigenous or settler or someone who has identified as a newcomer, we are all shaped by colonization here. Colonialism has impacted how we navigate the world. And so relationality for me is an anti-colonial movement because we are saying we're going to connect as people first. We are going to move in a human-centered way before everything else. And so whatever identities and shaping that we have, we can all spend time engaging as people in an experiential way, in a learning way, in an engaging way. So thank you so much for summarizing that. I didn't mean to go on a tangent, but you brought up lots of things for me, and I told you I'd go rogue. So with that, I'll invite, are there any other questions, thoughts, reflections that came up before we move forward? Okay. Well, that open invitation is always extended, so feel free to share later or during if it comes up for you. I did manage to refill my caffeine while we were in a breakout room. You're welcome. So I will keep talking fast and hopefully we can get through part 2 before our time runs out. Oh, colonial systems. All right. So with that, one of the reasons I started off with the worldviews in that way and really wanted to central relational perspectives is because for us to move with cultural humility, we have to move in a value-rooted way. And I use the word cultural humility over cultural safety for a couple of reasons. Cultural safety is a destination. It is achieving belonging, removing systemic barriers, ending discrimination, and the process of reconciliation, the process of safety are exactly that. They're processes, not destinations. And so cultural humility is about always being a work in progress and counting the changes and steps that we take forward and recognizing that it's always going to take work. I talk about safety, I talk about reconciliation, I talk about Indigenous relations, and I always talk about how they are relationships. And no matter how good or bad the relationship is, it always needs work. There is no achieving cultural safety. There's working towards cultural safety. And that's why I use cultural humility. We're walking the path of bettering that relationship, and we're always committing to putting that work forward. And so if we think about what cultural humility is, there's so many layers that we can talk about, but I narrowed it down to 4 that we can begin with. And then hopefully we'll have more chances to expand and navigate that on our journeys and learning from other voices and spaces that we hold and enter. And so with that, when I think about what does cultural humility look like, how do we move towards creating safety in the way that we move in spaces, in the way that we do our work, in the way that we do our daily practices, and the way that we build relationships with people? And so the first journey is always going to be a self journey where we learn to unpack the things that we didn't know we carried. That could be looking at some of the biases that we didn't realize influenced us. And thinking of that point that came up earlier, we are influenced by the way that we grew up. And so sometimes we don't realize how many influences are giving us impressions of Indigenous peoples, and we need to unpack the things that we carry and really look at them and say, are these true? Are these things that are stereotypes? Has this created bias in the way I look at the world? And we all carry bias, myself included, that we're all unpacking. As we move through unpacking ourselves, we also have to go through that learning of cultural differences and think about, okay, I want to be a safe place to be in relationship with. And so, yes, I'm going to unpack what I carry, but I also have to think about my norms and how they differ from the norms of the people I work with. And so we'll talk a little bit about those cultural differences between community and what is our Western cultural norms. And then moving towards that, we'll talk about how do we embody these values? What do we do now that we're talking about being relational? I have a list, but it's a vague list because, again, it's going to be a very personal experience. And then finally, something that I don't think we have enough space to honor and really deserves the space is deepening our relationship with truth. And I always say we have to deepen our relationship because colonization is ongoing. And there's also lots of truths that are still happening. And we have to reconcile that we're decolonizing and reconciling through colonization. They're happening at the same time, and we need to unpack that as well. And so as we think about what building cultural safety looks like, it means weaving those 4 paths together in a way that suits us and navigating our journey ourselves and working towards building safety by acknowledging these 4 directions. You're also going to hear me often say it's a process, not a destination. You'll also hear me say value over content. When I say value over content, how and the intentions and the values that choose our path of reconciliation will matter more than adding content in. And we'll talk about that more at the end, but I just want to emphasize that we want to be value rooted because we can't just take pieces of our worldview, we have to walk with it. And so as we think about how do we apply this to our work, I want us to think about how can we walk with these values, because that is the path to healing and moving through reconciliation in a different way. One of the things that came up in a lot of the feedback was talking about Indigenous specific stereotypes. And I won't spend too long here, but I do want to address them. And I do want to talk about how do we acknowledge and unpack the biases and stereotypes that we hold, and thinking about all of the different places and spaces that these biases influence us. And I call this the Indigenous anti-racism lens, where we have to start thinking about and reflecting on what perceptions do we hold of Indigenous peoples, and also what myths and misconceptions are constantly flooding us. One I hear a lot, especially as someone who works in universities, is First Nations people get free education. I wish. My student loans are high. There's no way that we all get free education. And I have my First Nations status, which is supposedly treaty rights, but that's the myth and misconception, which is that there are very, very, very specific circumstances where First Nations pay no taxes, where there's free education, where there's free housing. And it's not quite what it sounds like. There are so many restrictions on those scenarios that they do happen. But the other part of it is that they're not privileges or perks of being Indigenous. They are reparations and rights developed to undo harms. So when we think about why free housing is provided to First Nations people who live on reserve and win the lottery for housing and receive housing that may not be suitable for habitation, because that is a question mark, we are also acknowledging that that housing is needed because Indigenous communities were settled in spaces that were uninhabitable. Reserves were created far from a lot of territory in the most undesirable parts of a territory. And so getting labor, getting supplies and materials, getting tradespeople up to build housing in rural, remote areas that were where Indigenous people were relocated is a challenge. And so housing became part of the treaty process for a lot of treaty nations. The other social myths, when I think about all of the different ways that we are influenced on what indigeneity is, a lot of it is about justification. If we use horrible words like savage or Eskimo, which are slurs, we are saying we are coming to save. And there's that savior piece where we're saying, okay, we can justify the different regulations. We can justify assimilation because these stereotypes are given. And so when I think about Indigenous anti-racism, I want us to think about the way that Indigenous peoples are portrayed to us in spaces. How do we see Indigenous peoples in movies? How do we see Indigenous peoples in Halloween costumes? How do we see on social media? How have the issues of the Richmond land claims been portrayed in media? All of them have a very negative portrayal of Indigenous peoples. When I look at Halloween, those costumes definitely do not represent Indigenous peoples. They stereotype what we look like. They stereotype us as one pan-Indigenous culture. When I look at the land claim concerns that show up in the media, it's First Nations takes your land. Ironic in its own way, but it's a little bit of this heightened fear of these people are after you. And it's a fear-mongering tactic to support colonial systems. And so when I want us to think about and reflect upon and really kind of sit with in that discomfort is, what is my perception of Indigenous peoples and where has it come from? Have I been exposed to Indigenous created media? The way Indigenous people are portrayed in movies created by Indigenous people is very different than the cowboy and Indian movies that we see on TV. If we think about the ideas that our families have told us about Indigenous people as we grew up, very different perspective. And a lot of the different stereotypes that come out are for the benefit of supporting colonial institutions. And I'll give you one more example. And one of that is the alcoholism stereotype that appears. If we were to look at the last census, Indigenous peoples have the lowest alcohol consumption of any group in Canada. We drink less per week than any other defined race in that census. Alcohol was introduced to our communities as a negotiating tactic, as a way to barter and negotiate for territory, and also to show that we needed to be taken care of because we didn't know how to use alcohol because it was something that was introduced to community. And then it became a way of coping with systemic assimilation and genocide. And so when we think about that stereotype, it's rooted in colonialism, it's perpetuated by colonialism, and it doesn't accurately recognize our communities. And so I want us to just sit with that. Sit with the different perceptions, miscommunications, misconceptions, all of the stereotypes that we may carry, and do some homework and say, where did this originate from? Who benefited from it? And why do I carry it? And how can I shift? And that reflective process is how we're going to work through the hundreds of stereotypes that exist about Indigenous people. So I won't finish for today. So what I'll do is I'll do this and then we'll move a couple slides ahead. And one of the things I wanted to do is that, okay, we've talked about the stereotypes. We've talked about unpacking ourselves. What biases do I hold? What language do I use? Where does it come from? That's all things that we can do to work on ourselves to become more culturally safe spaces and work on our cultural humility. The second part of that cultural humility piece that we talked about was learning how to walk and understand the different cultural norms that we engage with. And specifically, I'll think about Indigenous cultural norms in this space. And I think about things that I have navigated and struggled with, especially working in colonial systems. And one of the big ones is communication styles. And communication style, I mean room for silence. I mean eye contact. I mean body language, tone changes, the way that we talk in story. There's not often room for that. And silence is a big part of the way I work. I know I'm talking a lot here, but generally speaking, if I'm in a meeting, I'm very quiet. And I'm often only talking if someone asks, "Hey, what do you think about that?" I don't do that because I don't have something to say. I don't do that because I can't keep up with the meeting. I do that for a couple of reasons. The first one is rooted in my role. I am often called Boo Boo by my community here, and they call me Boo Boo jokingly because I am the baby of the group who always has a boo boo. And so the reason of that, I mentioned that, is because that is exactly that. I am the baby. And my role when I'm hanging out with my elders or community members is to listen and listen well. I am not there to fill space. I am there to learn from the space that is offered from me. So sometimes I'll hang around and I'll make the elders tea and I'll make, one of my elders coffee and I'll just listen. I'm taking in the teachings, and that is my role at my age in those spaces. The other part is that because of all those stereotypes and because of my responsibility to community, I take my role very seriously. How I maneuver and bring myself into spaces impacts the reputation of Indigenous peoples. I have to be aware how I come across because that builds and feeds into stereotypes if I'm not careful. The third part of that is that I have a responsibility to all my relations. I have a responsibility to ensure that when I say things, when I do things, when I take action, that they are, one, respecting generations before, and two, benefiting generations after. I have to think about if how I'm saying things and when I'm saying things honors protocol. I have to think about whether this would be inclusive of all Indigenous peoples. Do I have to put a qualifier and say, well, some Indigenous peoples, or from my perspective? And I have a lot of thinking to do about generations before and after me before I can say something. A lot of meetings don't have space for me to do that 3, 4, 5 minute reflection. So by the time I've thought of a response to something that has been said, a meeting has moved 10 topics over. And I'm like, well, guess I'm not saying anything today. And it's because we haven't built in room for cultural differences. It is very normal for me to call my auntie, I called her on Monday, to sit on the phone and be in silence for like 20 minutes. And at minute 22, she decides to tell me about how she quartered her moose. Like, that is normal to sit in silence on the phone with somebody. From a Western perspective, that would kind of be awkward. We're used to trying to fill space, and I'm used to trying to make it. And so we have a cultural tension there, and it's rooted in community roles, it's rooted in community responsibility, and it's rooted in those relational values of I'm not just in relationship with the people I'm talking to, I'm in relationship with everything. I'm in relationship with generations before me and after me. I'm in relationship with all of the people on my web, and that's a lot to consider and need to create space for. And so when I think about cultural differences, that is one of the biggest examples I like to offer of how do we create space for different ways of being? How do we create space for us to be relational? What can we do to hold that space? Sometimes I start a group and I will say, okay, for the first 5 minutes, moment of silence. Ground yourselves. And we're grounding ourselves with two things. We're one, creating that space to put things down. I tell people, write lists. If there's things rolling in the back of your head and you're not present here, we're not going to be relational and sharing this space with shared interest. Second, it slows us down and grounds us to be present with a similar goal. Because now what was in your head is now put down and you can just root yourself in the interconnected space that you're creating. And so build in room for silence, build in room for slowing down, build in room for just being present. And then that also builds in room for cultural differences. Sometimes I do have protocols I want to share, but I'm waiting, one, for them to be invited. Sometimes I'll say, if there's any protocols that need to be entering the space, please feel welcome. Sometimes I'll think about it and the space has shifted. And so really taking that moment to slow down and pause invites in those cultural differences, even if they're not communication based. And moving through a relational way, the person in front of you can share what those specific cultural differences they're bringing in are and how you can honor them. But we need space and trust and relationship to do that. I'll come back to that if we have time. One of the things I wanted to do before we ran out of time, which I'm starting to worry about, but that's fine, is I want to make sure that there's time for one more breakout room and a little bit of questions, which is why I'm panicking. But I do want to mention, how do we embody these principles and values daily? And like I said, there's a list, but it's not a direct list, because everything that we do is going to be relational if we're walking in a relational way, which means it's a relationship with self, a relationship with reconciliation, and a relationship with the Indigenous people that you are working with. And so that first piece that we talked about is building in silences, building in time for stories. Sometimes a fun thing I love to do, which you even saw today, is I start off spaces with story. And it's not because I just want to be relational, but it also reminds us to embody and walk with those principles. I chose to walk with story, and we're going to open that way and set the tone that way. And I think about, how can we incorporate story work in the way that we engage? The other part that I want to talk about that we haven't touched on yet is, how do we navigate and create different opportunities to navigate systems? And one of the big pieces that I'd love to advocate for is that all of us have the ability to decolonize systems. We each are able to find ways that we can change it. This is why. What are systems? What are colonial systems? They are people. If we need to change a rule, if we need to create a different pathway, if we need to open things up, if we need more flexibility, who do we go to? Another person. And then that person goes to another person. Systems are not something that are unchangeable. They're connected by people. And so when we think about, I can't decolonize systems, or like, I don't know what to do, be relational. Talk to each other. Say, where in the system can I make change? And so what I'm thinking about is, how can you do this in your work? How can you say, I'm going to change systems in my work? And that's all the questions at the bottom, and I'll talk about each of them. I want us to be very intentional, and just maybe for the next week, kind of reflect on why you do what you do. So if there's certain practices or systems or things that you do day to day, why do you do it? What is the intention behind it? Who created it? What is the reason for this practice? It might be very practical, like we need this information. It might be like, I've always done it that way. If you hear the I've always done it this way, that's something that we should probably question a little bit further, and then go, okay, who is impacted by me doing this? Are there people who were left out? And one of the things I often emphasize is that systems were created without Indigenous people, but they were also created specifically to remove us. And so if we have a system in place, 99% of the time, especially if it wasn't created recently, it excludes Indigenous people. And we have to think about, okay, how can I change this? How can I bring in an Indigenous space? And I have a 3-tier checklist that I do myself. It might be helpful to you, it might not. Is I start off with, how can I change this? Like, can we just create something new that is inclusive of Indigenous peoples? Depending on our relationships, sometimes that's really possible. If we don't have that ability, we go to step 2, which is, how can I create an additional pathway? Is there a way that I can create another system that is more inclusive along with this one, so that people have the choice? They can take the traditional colonial system, or they can take this different flexible opportunity that is more inclusive of their worldviews. If that is not an option, and usually that's the compromise point, then if you have to keep walking with the system, the question becomes, how can I support people navigating the system so that it's less harmful for them? For example, if there's forms that have to be filled out, Can you create a relational process saying, if you need support filling out this form, call this person? And create a connection point so that there's a human attached so that we can say, okay, we need this form. It's a government document. It happens on the other side of the country. I have no control over this, but I have control on how we present it to people and the system and the way that we implement it. And so how can we create a supportive environment for navigating a system that isn't quite ready to change? I call that the last resort, but it's still better than doing nothing and saying it is what it is. And thinking about that in all of our stages of our work. If there's something that comes up, if there's a barrier that comes up, what can we do and respond in it? And the final thing that I'll mention, well, actually I lied. The second to last thing I'll mention is that we should create pathways for response. One of the things that we can do and advocate for is having a clear path of how to respond when we're notified or see a systemic barrier. If someone is vulnerable enough to provide feedback saying this form was awful, I didn't like the terminology that's used here, I feel singled out here, we need to know that that feedback will be honored by having an action follow-up. Something needs to happen. It can't sit in a spiral of this is feedback we have, what do we do with it? There needs to be a way of saying this is the contact person, this is the person who's going to problem solve and try to figure out how we remove this barrier. Or, we call a meeting with ABCD people to talk about this feedback so that we don't leave it without a solution and really honor the vulnerability of the people who are flagging the things that are harmful, because that's hard to do. And so they did the work, and reciprocity would be responding with action. And so how can we build in our own way of creating paths to respond to things that are flagged to our attention? And the final thing that I promised I'd mention before I move forward is messiness. This work is messy. Relationships are messy. I am messy. That's why I call my strategy going rogue, because I'm all over the place. I make horrible jokes. I tried to think about them today because I'm being recorded, but life is messy. And so as we think about this work, we have to give ourselves permission to make mistakes and to be messy and to try and to navigate things. I only have one little thing that I say about messiness. Make as many mistakes as you want, but make sure they're all new ones. We should be making new mistakes every single time. If we're making the same mistakes, that's a problem because we're not holding ourselves accountable, we're not learning from our experiences. But for this work to move forward, we have to keep trying. Imagine a toddler who fell down and never got back up. We'd all be crawling. We need to be messy and make mistakes as long as they are new ones. And so we try something, it didn't work, share that. Those failures are great experiences to learn from. Celebrate it. I want to throw a party every time I mess up because it means I tried. And it means I'm trying a different way to see if it works. And if I fall flat on my face, oh well, I'll try something new. And that's the encouragement I hope that you have and the grace that you have for yourself, which is if you are creating a relational path to reconciliation, if you are building your own path based on your gifts, based on your role, based on where you are in your system, it's going to be messy and you're going to make mistakes. And that's a celebration. So, what does this all mean? It means that the only tangible thing about this work is relationality. The only tangible path, the only direct instruction I can give you moving forward is be relational. Relationality holds all of those values: reciprocity, responsibility, respect. They're all part of being in a good, healthy relationship. Relationality honors the fact that reconciliation is a relationship. It's not a destination. When we're doing this work, it's process and progress. There is no product. Relationality itself is the work. The relationship is the path to reconciliation because that's exactly what it means, restoring a relationship. And I don't know about you, but I kind of joke about this being a marriage. Could you imagine being like, oh, we're married now, no more work? That would not work out. All right. And so relationality is a process. That relationship, whether good or bad, is going to need effort at all times. And so we have to think about it as a process that is non-linear and goes ups and downs, and it will have hard times and good times. And that's just the nature of it. And so when we have those moments where we feel overwhelmed or like we don't know what to do, that's normal. That's just part of that messiness. And finally, I'll just remind us that relationality holds us accountable. We are in relationship, and those relationships will notice if we're not consistent. They will notice if we're not transparent. They will notice if we're not honoring our commitments. One of the things I said today as we opened up the space was, I commit to holding space for this conversation. And part of the reason I add a commitment to that acknowledgement is to, one, acknowledge that acknowledgements are not just protocols. They're not something that you just say and forget. But two, that they are a commitment to this work. And I name my commitment to hold myself accountable to the people I'm in front of. You heard me say it, I now have to do it. And so relationships and the way we are connected with people will hold us accountable, and they will also support us as we learn from each other's experiences, as we work through the work together, as we navigate the space, and as we try to go, what do we do? Because no one has the answer. And I opened up with, we're all learners here, because there is not one way, there are millions. And I mean millions, because each of us is going to have a different relationship with each Indigenous person that we work with, and we're each going to have our own relationship with reconciliation ourselves. And so there is no one path. The only path that I see that I can guide you on is to move with those values and be value rooted. So with that, we have about 10 minutes left. I wanted to do that, but instead I'll just share it with you later. And I'll just want to leave about 10 minutes for questions. And so if there's reflections or things that are sitting with you, things that are kind of on your mind that you'd like to share, that's an invitation. I will mention that I have a little bit of a guide worksheet that I'll share with you afterwards, so that it gives you a little bit of a reminder of things that came up. I'll also add my email address in case you want to reach out with something that you didn't want to share in a bigger space. And I hope that this has been helpful for you, and I hope that we have a lot of reflection and conversation happening among all of you moving forward. And with that, I will stop talking and invite any reflections and questions or 2 a.m. shower thoughts that enter the space.